Hey guys, tonight we begin with one of humanity's greatest talents, coming up with increasingly creative ways to hurt each other when talking no longer works. Before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe. But only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. No pressure. I'm not here to lay siege to your village or confiscate your firewood. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Medieval warfare wasn't a noble contest of honor, bravery, and mutual respect. That idea mostly exists because centuries later, people who were not there needed something comforting to believe. In reality, medieval combat was a design problem that kept getting worse, like an arms race run by people who had never heard the phrase, "Maybe this is enough." Every battle asked the same question. How do we stop the other person from continuing to exist? Preferably before lunch. At first, swords worked fine. Then armor happened. Lots of armor. More armor every year. Knights kept adding metal plates like they were afraid the enemy might try to hug them too hard. Soon, warriors resembled walking cookware. Confident, loud, and increasingly difficult to deal with. Weapon makers responded the only way they knew how. Panic mixed with creativity. If cutting stopped working, they crushed. If crushing failed, they punctured. If puncturing didn't solve the issue, they hooked, yanked, tripped, or simply knocked the other person over and let gravity finish the conversation. Medieval engineers did not believe in elegant solutions. They believed in, did it work, yes or no? And what's impressive, or deeply concerning, is how fast innovation happened. Someone would show up to a battlefield in thicker armor, and within a few years everyone else would be carrying a brand new weapon specifically designed to make that armor feel like a bad financial decision. No refunds, no warranty. Blacksmiths experimented constantly. They added spikes because why not? They added chains because rigidity had failed them emotionally. They extended handles so soldiers could maintain a safe emotional distance from the screaming. Every design choice screamed, "I learned this the hard way." This creativity wasn't limited to professionals. Farmers modified tools. Hunters repurposed gear. Militia showed up holding things that technically had other jobs last week. If it could transfer force and cause regret, it was weaponized immediately. The battlefield became a testing ground for bad ideas that worked far too well. And once an idea worked, it spread quickly. There were no ethics committees, no safety testing, no, let's think this through. There was only survival and the quiet hope that whatever you built wouldn't bounce back and hit you. Medieval warfare wasn't poetic, it wasn't romantic, it was iterative design under extreme stress. And every strange, terrifying weapon you're about to see is proof that when humans are cold, scared, and armored like refrigerators, creativity becomes mandatory. The flail is what happens when medieval weapon designers looked at a perfectly normal stick and thought, this is far too safe. At its core, the flail is simple. A handle, a chain, and a spiked ball attached at the end. In practice, it is uncontrolled chaos, physics with anger issues, and a complete rejection of personal safety. The logic behind the flail was actually clever. Shields were becoming a problem, armor was getting thicker, straight weapons bounced. So someone asked the most medieval question imaginable. What if the weapon didn't stop when it hit something? Enter the chain. The flail could swing around shields, over armor, and occasionally into the face of the person wielding it. Innovation has risks. Unlike swords, the flail had no interest in elegance. There was no graceful fencing, no careful timing, no polite exchange of blows. You swung it, and the battlefield figured out the rest. The chain absorbed momentum, redirected force, and turned every movement into a surprise. Even experienced fighters never fully knew where the spiked head would land. This kept enemies nervous, and allies extremely alert. The flail's biggest strength was psychological. Facing a flail wasn't just dangerous, it was stressful. Shields became unreliable. Armor felt less comforting. Every swing threatened to sneak around defenses like an uninvited guest who knew your schedule. The sound alone, metal rattling, chains snapping through the air, was enough to raise heart rates before contact was even made. Of course, the flail had one tiny flaw. It was just as dangerous to the user. Tight formations? Bad idea. Confined spaces? Worse idea. Swinging too hard? Congratulations. You've discovered recoil the medieval way. Many injuries attributed to battlefield accidents were likely flail-related misunderstandings between weapon and owner. This is why flails were never universally adopted. They required space, strength, and the acceptance that sometimes the weapon simply made its own decisions. Not every soldier wanted to gamble their life on an object that behaved like it resented being held. Still, the flail represents medieval creativity perfectly. It wasn't refined. It wasn't safe. But it solved a problem. Shields stopped working quite so well, armor became less reassuring, and chaos was introduced into an already chaotic environment. The flail wasn't designed to be perfect. It was designed to be unpredictable. And in medieval warfare, unpredictability was sometimes the deadliest feature of all. At some point in medieval history, weapon designers collectively gave up on subtlety. Swords weren't cutting it anymore. Literally. Armor had become so effective that slicing attacks often resulted in nothing more than a loud clang and an awkward pause where both fighters reconsidered their life choices. And so, the mace was born, a weapon that asked a very simple question. What if we stopped trying to get through the armor and just punished the person inside it? The mace didn't care about sharp edges or elegant technique. It was blunt force trauma with confidence. A solid handle topped with a heavy, often flanged head, designed to concentrate force into small areas. You didn't need to pierce armor. You just needed to hit it hard enough that the body underneath filed a formal complaint. Flanges were the real innovation. Instead of a smooth ball that spread impact evenly, flanges focused energy into narrow ridges. This meant more damage, more shock, and more regret per swing. Armor dented. Bones cracked. Internal organs learned that helmets were not, in fact, soundproof. What made the mace especially appealing was its simplicity. No edge to sharpen, no blade to chip, no complicated technique required. If you could lift it and swing it, you were already qualified. Medieval armies appreciated this efficiency. Training took time. Panic did not. The mace also had a deeply psychological effect. Being hit by a sword hurt, but it often came with visible wounds. Being hit by a mace. That left you standing there, confused, dizzy, and suddenly questioning why the world was spinning. Knights discovered that surviving a mace strike didn't mean they were fine. It just meant the damage was happening invisibly, inside their very expensive armor. Clerics even favored maces, supposedly because they avoided shedding blood. This was technically true, in the same way that dropping a piano on someone avoids stabbing them. The end result was still extremely final. Of course, maces had downsides. They were heavy, they required strength, and they weren't particularly inspiring to look at. No one ever gazed upon a mace and thought, "Ah yes, beauty." But medieval warfare wasn't about aesthetics. It was about efficiency. The mace represented a turning point. Armor was no longer protection. It was packaging, and the mace was the delivery method. If the mace was medieval frustration made solid, the war hammer was frustration given a graduate degree. Weapon designers had already accepted that cutting was overrated and crushing was effective. The warhammer simply refined the idea and added a very clear message. Your armor investment was a mistake. At first glance, the warhammer looks almost polite, smaller than a mace, narrower, less dramatic. But this was not kindness. This was focus. One side of the head was usually a flat hammer face, designed to deliver concentrated blunt force. The other side was often a sharp spike or beak, meant to punch into armor, helmets, or joints like a medieval can opener. The genius of the warhammer was its precision. You didn't need to swing wildly. You didn't need dramatic momentum. You needed accuracy. A A solid strike to the helmet could scramble thoughts instantly. A blow to the shoulder could numb an entire arm. A well-placed spike could turn a knight's sense of invincibility into immediate panic. Armor wearers quickly learned a hard truth. Protection did not equal safety. Plate armor distributed force, but it did not cancel it. A warhammer didn't slice through metal. It transmitted energy straight through it. The armor stayed intact. The person inside did not. This made warhammers especially popular in close combat. When battles collapsed into chaotic scrums of shouting, slipping, and very poor footing, the warhammer excelled. It was compact, fast, devastating. And unlike swords, it didn't get stuck or bounce off at the worst possible moment. The spike side added insult to injury. It targeted weak points, visors, armpits, joints, anywhere the armor had to bend. Knights spent years training to move in armor, only to discover that one sharp beak could undo all that effort in a second. Confidence vanished quickly after the first dented helmet. Warhammers also had a psychological advantage. They looked purposeful. This was not a weapon you accidentally carried. If someone approached you with a warhammer, you knew exactly what they intended, and none of it involved discussion. In many ways, the warhammer marked the moment medieval warfare fully embraced physics over tradition. No romance, no ceremony, just leverage, momentum, and the understanding that metal does not stop force, it merely redirects it. For armored warriors, this was a sobering realization. For warhammer designers, it was a success story. At some point, medieval soldiers collectively realized an important truth. Being close to danger was optional. You didn't actually need to stand face to face with a heavily armored, angry stranger to solve the problem. You could simply keep them far away and make it their problem instead. And thus, the polearm rose to prominence. Polearms were the long-handled multi-tools of medieval warfare. Spears, halberds, glaives, bills. If it had a long stick and something unpleasant attached to the end, it qualified. The design philosophy was simple. Maximize reach, minimize regret. A spear alone already changed everything. Suddenly, foot soldiers could threaten knights before the knight's sword even became relevant. A line of spears turned infantry into a moving wall of absolutely not. Horses refused to charge. Armor became irrelevant if you couldn't get close enough to use it. Distance wasn't cowardice. It was strategy with self-respect. Then things escalated. Designers began adding blades, hooks, spikes, and edges to the spearhead, turning it into something that could stab, slash, hook, and occasionally ruin a rider's entire afternoon. The halberd, for example, combined an axe blade, a spear point, and a hook, because one way of causing problems clearly wasn't enough. Polearms were especially effective against knights on horseback. Horses are brave, but they are not stupid. A wall of sharp objects pointed at chest height sends a very clear message. If the horse stopped, the knight stopped. If the knight stopped, gravity took over. Gravity has always been one of medieval warfare's most reliable allies. There was also a morale advantage. Facing a single sword was intimidating. Facing a dozen polearms moving in unison was terrifying. Infantry units trained to keep formation, brace together, and advance slowly. Individual heroics mattered less than collective pressure. Medieval warfare quietly shifted from look impressive to stay alive. Of course, polearms weren't glamorous. You didn't duel with them. You didn't pose heroically. You stood in line, held your ground, and trusted your neighbors not to panic. It was less romantic and far more effective. In many ways, polearms represented maturity in medieval warfare. Less flair, more practicality, more understanding that distance reduces risk. Polearms didn't promise glory, they promised survival. And in medieval combat, that was the most creative weapon of all. The Bec de Corbin is proof that medieval weapon designers were not done experimenting. They had simply grown more specific. If the warhammer made armor uncomfortable, the Bec de Corbin made it personal. This was not a general-purpose weapon. This was a targeted complaint delivered at high speed. At first glance, the Bector Korban looks like a warhammer that decided to specialize. One side featured a hammer face for crushing armor. The other side ended in a long, curved spike, the crow's beak, designed to puncture, hook, and generally ruin the structural integrity of anything wearing expensive metal. The brilliance of the Bector Korban was versatility. You could smash with it, you could puncture with it, and if neither worked immediately, you could hook your opponent and introduce them to the ground, which medieval warfare considered a perfectly acceptable finishing move. Knights spent years learning how to stay mounted, balanced, and dignified, only to be yanked off their horse like a sack of grain. Armor joints were the real targets. Elbows, knees, visors, armpits, all the places armor had to bend to remain functional. The crow's beak slipped into these gaps with disturbing ease. Suddenly, all that steel protection turned into a very expensive trap you were stuck inside. The Bector Korban also excelled at intimidation. There is something deeply unsettling about being approached by someone holding a long pole topped with a hammer on one side and a curved spike on the other. It looked less like a weapon and more like a medieval instructional tool titled How This Ends. And unlike swords, the Bector Korban didn't require elegance. It required intent. You didn't fence with it. You advanced, selected a target, and applied force until the situation resolved itself. Training mattered, but enthusiasm mattered more. This weapon thrived in the later medieval period, when plate armor reached its peak. Knights were well protected, confident, and increasingly frustrated that people kept inventing tools specifically designed to negate that protection. The Bector Korban was the embodiment of that frustration. In many ways, it marked the moment medieval warfare stopped pretending armor was invincible. It wasn't about breaking the armor. It was about exploiting it. The Bector Korban didn't argue with armor. It negotiated with leverage, and it usually won. If medieval weapons had a most controversial category, the crossbow would win it without competition. Not because it was especially flashy, or elegant, or honorable, but because it worked a little too well, and it worked for the wrong people. Up until the crossbow became widespread, killing a fully armored knight required years of training, physical strength, and an unfortunate amount of bravery. Knights liked this system. It justified their social status, their expensive equipment, and their belief that they were naturally superior at violence. The crossbow arrived and quietly ruined all of that. The problem with the crossbow was simple. It removed skill from the equation. A peasant with minimal training could pick one up, aim it roughly in the correct direction, and deliver a bolt with enough force to punch through armor, mail, or exposed joints. Generations of martial tradition undone by a mechanical trigger and bad intentions. This deeply upset the ruling classes. Crossbows were powerful because they stored energy mechanically. You didn't need great strength. The bowstring was drawn using levers, cranks, or windlasses. Once loaded, the weapon waited patiently, like it was holding a grudge. When released, all that stored energy went straight into the bolt and then directly into someone's day. They were accurate, they were deadly, and they were terrifying. Knights described crossbows as cowardly weapons, which is medieval language for, "This is extremely inconvenient for me personally." The church even attempted to ban them for use against Christians, declaring them unfit for honorable warfare. This declaration was immediately ignored by everyone who wanted to survive. On the battlefield, crossbows changed behavior. Knights avoided open ground, shields grew larger, armor designs shifted. Pavis shields, large portable walls, appeared specifically so crossbowmen could reload without becoming targets themselves. Warfare adapted around the weapon because it could not be ignored, and the psychological impact was enormous. You didn't see a crossbow bolt coming. You didn't hear a warning. One moment you were confident in your armor. The next you were on the ground wondering when everything went sideways. Crossbows weren't creative in shape. They were creative in consequence. They flattened social hierarchies and made medieval warfare less about lineage and more about positioning, patience, and luck. The crossbow didn't care who you were. It didn't care what you wore. It cared only about whether you were standing in the wrong place at the wrong time. And that made it one of the most feared weapons of the medieval world. Not every medieval weapon needed to be large, loud, or impressive. Some of the most effective designs were tiny, quiet, and powered entirely by spite. Enter the caltrop, a small spiked object designed with one simple promise. No matter how it lands, one spike will always point upward, waiting patiently to ruin someone's day. Caltrops were medieval minimalism at its finest. No moving parts, no training required, no honor involved. You didn't swing them, aim them, or duel with them. You simply scattered them on the ground and let physics and poor footwear handle the rest. It was weaponized inconvenience taken to its logical extreme. The real victims of caltrops weren't just soldiers, they were horses, and medieval armies lived and died by their horses. A single caltrop under a hoof could cripple an animal instantly, turning a powerful cavalry charge into a confused, screaming mess of stopped momentum and shattered confidence. Knights might survive injuries. Horses rarely did. For infantry, caltrops were psychological warfare. You couldn't see them easily. You couldn't hear them. And once you knew they were present, every step became a negotiation. Marching slowed. Formations broke. Panic crept in. All because of a handful of metal objects small enough to fit in a pouch. What made caltrops especially cruel was their efficiency. They were cheap to produce, easy to transport, and reusable if you were brave enough to retrieve them afterward. Armies could deny entire areas to enemy movement without lifting a sword. Roads, fields, choke points all became hazards simply because someone had scattered tiny spikes and walked away smiling. Caltrops also ignored armor entirely. Plate protection meant nothing if you couldn't walk. Shields were useless. Skill didn't matter. Rank didn't matter. Everyone had feet. Everyone needed them. Medieval designers understood this deeply and leaned into it without hesitation. There was no romance in caltrops. No dramatic charge. No heroic clash. Just a sudden, sharp realization that the ground itself had turned against you. Many battles were delayed, redirected, or abandoned simply because advancing safely was no longer possible. In a strange way, caltrops represent medieval warfare at its most honest. No speeches, no ceremony, just a quiet acknowledgement that sometimes the best way to win is to make movement impossible. Caltrops didn't kill you directly. They just made sure you couldn't run when everything else tried to. And in medieval warfare, that was often worse. If the mace was medieval blunt force trauma in its purest form, the Morning Star was that same idea after someone said, "But what if we added spikes for emphasis?" The result was a weapon that took everything uncomfortable about being hit with a mace and made it emotionally discouraging as well. At first glance, the Morning Star looks almost decorative, a metal ball covered in spikes, attached to a handle like some sort of violent ornament. This is misleading. The spikes were not for style. They were there to ensure that even armor that survived the initial impact still had regrets afterward. The logic was brutally simple. A smooth mace head distributed force evenly, which was great for crushing bones but occasionally allowed armor to do its job too well. The Morning Star corrected this by concentrating impact into smaller, angrier points. Instead of spreading the force, it focused it. Armor dented deeper. Padding compressed harder. Whatever was underneath learned an important lesson about consequences. Morning Stars also had a psychological edge. Spikes do something to the human brain. A plain metal ball says, "This will hurt." A spiked one says, "This will hurt," and I enjoyed designing it. Facing a Morning Star was unsettling in a way that went beyond physics. It looked personal. Unlike flails, most Morning Stars were rigid. No chain, no chaos, no surprise recoil. This made them safer for the user and more predictable in formation fighting. You could swing with confidence, knowing the weapon wasn't going to come back and demand an apology afterward. They were also durable. No delicate edges, no sharpening, No maintenance beyond, is it still heavy and covered in spikes? If yes, you were good to go. Medieval armies appreciated weapons that survived abuse, weather, and occasional misuse by people who hadn't slept properly in weeks. Morning stars found their place especially in close combat, where space was limited and panic was plentiful. A single swing could knock an opponent off balance, crack armor, and instantly drain morale. Even if the enemy survived, they rarely wanted to continue the conversation. In many ways, the Morning Star represented medieval escalation. Maces worked, so someone asked how to make them worse. The answer was spikes. Always spikes. The Morning Star wasn't subtle, it wasn't elegant. It was a reminder that medieval creativity often followed one rule. If it works, add spikes and try again. If handheld weapons were medieval creativity on a personal level, siege weapons were creativity scaled up until it required math, teamwork, and a worrying lack of empathy. At some point, medieval armies looked at fortified cities, thick walls, tall towers, smug defenders, and decided the solution was to throw buildings at buildings. Enter siege engines. Trebuchets, mangonels, and ballistae weren't just weapons. They were statements. They said, "We don't want to fight you. We want your wall to stop existing." And if that wall happened to be attached to a city, that was simply collateral inconvenience. The trebuchet was the star of the show. Powered by gravity and an unholy amount of patience, it could hurl massive stones over long distances with terrifying accuracy. Watching one operate was like witnessing physics lose its temper. Crews carefully adjusted angles, counterweights, and release points, all so a single rock could fly through the air and politely remove a section of masonry. But stones were only the beginning. Medieval armies quickly realized that fear traveled farther than rocks. So they launched burning materials, diseased animal carcasses, and occasionally very loud messages in the form of whatever was lying around. Nothing says "please surrender" like a decomposing cow landing in your courtyard. Ballistae, essentially oversized crossbows, delivered bolts the size of tree trunks. These weren't meant for precision duels. They were meant to punch through gates, towers, and morale simultaneously. Mangonels hurled stones with less finesse but more enthusiasm, proving that accuracy was optional when momentum was impressive enough. Siege weapons changed warfare by shifting combat from personal bravery to industrial persistence. You didn't win by skill alone. You won by outlasting, outthinking, and outbuilding your enemy. Sieges could last weeks or months, grinding down defenders psychologically, long before walls actually fell. And here's the truly creative part. Most siege engines were built on site. Armies showed up with tools, timber, and instructions, then constructed enormous weapons within sight of the people they planned to use them on. Imagine watching your enemy assemble a machine specifically designed to destroy your home. That's medieval confidence. Siege warfare wasn't elegant. It was slow, brutal, and deeply uncomfortable. But it worked. Walls cracked, cities surrendered, and medieval engineers proved that sometimes the most effective weapon wasn't something you held in your hands. It was something that reshaped the battlefield entirely. Siege weapons didn't just attack defenses. They attacked hope. After centuries of inventing increasingly creative ways to kill each other, medieval soldiers finally paused and asked a rare, thoughtful question. What if we didn't die right away? The answer was the Pavis shield, a piece of equipment that marks the moment medieval warfare briefly flirted with self-preservation. The Pavisi wasn't a shield in the heroic sense. You didn't charge with it. You didn't duel with it. You didn't look impressive holding it. It was large, rectangular, and about as elegant as a wooden door ripped off its hinges. But it worked, and that made it beautiful in a very practical medieval way. Designed primarily for crossbowmen, the Pavis was essentially a portable wall. Soldiers planted it into the ground, crouched behind it, and used it as cover while reloading. A process that took long enough for an enemy archer to finish a prayer, loose a shot, and reconsider their career. Without cover, reloading was a gamble. With a Pavis, it became survivable. These shields were often tall enough to protect the entire body, and sometimes curved slightly to deflect incoming missiles. Many were painted with symbols, city crests, or religious imagery, because nothing says "please protect me" like a saint watching over your reload cycle. The Pavis changed battlefield behaviour. Crossbow units became more disciplined, more stationary, and more lethal. Instead of firing once and running, they could hold ground, reload safely, and keep pressure on advancing enemies. This frustrated knights immensely, which in medieval warfare was often the goal. Of course, the Pavise came with downsides. It was heavy, awkward, and absolutely not something you wanted to carry uphill while arrows were flying. Soldiers assigned to carry Pavises were basically medieval interns, vital, underappreciated, and constantly wondering how their life choices led here. Still, the Pavis represents an important shift. Medieval warfare began to acknowledge that survival mattered. Protection wasn't just armor anymore. It was positioning, teamwork, and the willingness to hide behind a very large piece of wood. The Pavis wasn't flashy. It didn't inspire songs. But it saved lives, which, in medieval warfare, was revolutionary. Once medieval warfare discovered fire, things escalated quickly. Fire didn't care about armor, rank, training, or confidence. Fire simply arrived and announced that everyone's plans were cancelled. It was the most democratic weapon medieval armies ever used, and they loved it for that reason. Fire weapons came in many forms: flaming arrows, burning pitch, pots of oil set alight and hurled over walls. If it could burn and could be thrown, medieval armies tried it at least once, sometimes twice, just to be sure. The goal wasn't always destruction. Often it was panic, and fire was very good at that. Flaming arrows were less about accuracy and more about chaos. One arrow landing on a thatched roof could turn a quiet town into a screaming maze of smoke and confusion. Suddenly, defenders weren't guarding walls. They were desperately trying to stop their own homes from disappearing behind them. Fire didn't need to kill you directly. It just needed to make you abandon your position. Burning pitch was worse. Thick, sticky, and stubbornly committed to staying on fire, pitch clung to wood, walls, and anything unfortunate enough to be nearby. Once ignited, it refused to be put out easily. Water laughed at it. Sand helped sometimes. Panic did nothing except make it spread faster. Then there was Greek fire, the stuff of legend. A mysterious incendiary weapon that burned even on water, terrified enemies, and ensured that nobody who faced it ever forgot the experience. Exact formulas were closely guarded, which is medieval for no one wanted this used on them later. Fire weapons worked best psychologically. Flames lit up the night, smoke choked the air. The sound alone, crackling, roaring, collapsing structures, drained morale faster than any blade. Soldiers broke ranks. Commanders lost control. Orders vanished in the noise. Fire also turned sieges into nightmares. Cities depended on wooden structures, food stores, and morale. A well-placed fire could undo months of preparation in minutes. Even if the fire was contained, the fear lingered. Defenders slept lightly, watching shadows flicker and wondering when the next flame would appear. Medieval warfare loved fire because it solved problems quickly. It didn't need precision. It didn't need bravery. It just needed opportunity and a strong wind. Fire didn't argue. Fire didn't negotiate. Fire reminded everyone that sometimes the most creative weapon is the one that removes all other options. Not every medieval battle was fought with beautifully crafted weapons forged by master blacksmiths. In fact, many battles were fought with whatever happened to be within arm's reach at the exact moment things went terribly wrong. This is where improvised weapons entered the chat, uninvited, unregulated, and extremely enthusiastic. Medieval warfare rarely followed the plan. Formations broke, weapons snapped, people tripped, horses panicked. And suddenly, the battlefield became a chaotic flea market of sharp objects, heavy objects, and objects that had no business being involved in combat, but absolutely were now. Broken spears became clubs. Sword hilts became punching tools. Shields were used less for blocking, and more for aggressively introducing someone to the ground. Rocks were picked up and thrown with impressive emotional commitment. Helmets were grabbed by the rim and used as handles. If you could lift it, swing it, or drop it from above, congratulations, you had a weapon. Farm tools were especially popular, because medieval armies were often made up of farmers who had already spent years mastering these objects. Axes, scythes, pitchforks, flails that were originally for grain, all transitioned into combat roles with minimal adjustment. The only real difference was intent. One moment you're harvesting crops, the next you're harvesting enemies. Medieval life moved fast. Improvised weapons were brutally effective because they were unexpected. Armor was designed to stop known threats: swords, spears, arrows. It was far less prepared for being beaten with a wagon wheel or stabbed with a sharpened fence post. Chaos favors the adaptable, and improvisation thrived in chaos. There was also a psychological factor. Facing a trained knight with a polished weapon was intimidating. Facing an exhausted peasant swinging a random object with nothing left to lose was deeply unsettling. That person was not following rules. That person was not concerned with survival statistics. That person was a problem. Improvised weapons remind us that medieval warfare wasn't just about equipment. It was about mindset. When structure collapsed, creativity filled the gap. No manuals, no permission, just raw survival instinct turned into action. In many battles, the most dangerous moment wasn't the charge or the clash. It was the aftermath, when order disappeared and everyone started solving problems on the fly. Improvised weapons weren't elegant. They weren't planned. But they worked, and that made them just as medieval as anything forged in steel. For all the steel, spikes, fire, and clever engineering, medieval warfare ran on one invisible fuel more powerful than any weapon: fear. Most medieval weapons weren't designed just to kill. They were designed to terrify. If you could break the enemy's nerve, the battle ended faster, cheaper, and with far less effort. Medieval commanders understood this deeply, even if they never phrased it so politely. Consider the sheer visual chaos of a medieval battlefield. Clanking armor, shouting men, horses screaming like they had just realized what was happening, weapons covered in spikes, chains rattling, banners flapping dramatically for absolutely no practical reason. Everything about the scene was engineered to overwhelm the senses. Fear wasn't accidental. It was curated. Many weapons were shaped specifically to look unsettling. Spikes served no purpose once someone was already dead, but they were excellent at making people reconsider advancing. Chains made noise. Noise meant panic. Fire lit up the night sky, turning darkness into a flickering nightmare. Siege engines loomed in the distance, silently promising that walls, homes, and hope were temporary concepts. Even sound itself became a weapon. Drums beat rhythms meant to unsettle. Horns blared unpredictably. The roar of a charging army wasn't just noise, it was psychological pressure applied in waves. Your body reacted before your brain had time to argue. Fear also spread faster than facts. One unit breaking ranks could trigger a collapse across an entire army. You didn't need to kill everyone. You just needed to convince them they were already losing. Medieval weapons that looked brutal helped accelerate that process. If someone nearby fell screaming after encountering a flail, morning star, or burning pitch, everyone else paid attention. Armor didn't stop fear. Training didn't stop fear. Experience sometimes made it worse, because veterans knew exactly what those weapons could do. Confidence shattered quickly when imagination filled in the blanks. Even after battles ended, fear lingered. Survivors carried memories, scars, and stories back home. Tales of horrifying weapons spread faster than armies ever could, ensuring that future opponents arrived already nervous. In medieval warfare, killing was often secondary. Winning meant control. Control came from breaking morale. And morale broke when fear took hold. Steel cut bodies, fire destroyed structures, but fear dismantled armies from the inside. And medieval weapon designers, whether they admitted it or not, knew exactly what they were doing. When you strip away the armor, the banners, the spikes, and the unsettling enthusiasm for fire, medieval weapons all share one origin: survival. Not glory, not cruelty for its own sake. Survival in a world where losing meant death, poverty, or watching everything you owned burn behind a stone wall. Medieval weapon creativity wasn't driven by imagination in the artistic sense. It was driven by necessity. Armor improved, so weapons adapted. Walls rose higher, so stones flew farther. Shields blocked blades, so chains wrapped around them. Every invention was a reaction, not a fantasy. Someone encountered a problem, survived it just barely, and then went home thinking, that cannot happen again. And so the cycle continued. What makes medieval weapons so fascinating isn't just how brutal they were, it's how practical they were. There was no wasted effort, no decorative excess without purpose. Every spike, hook, flange, and awkward angle existed, because it solved a specific problem someone had faced in combat. Medieval engineers weren't trying to impress future museum visitors. They were trying to make sure tomorrow still existed. There's also something deeply human about this creativity. When resources were limited, people used what they had. Farm tools became weapons. Construction techniques became siege engines. Physics became a trusted ally. Even fear itself was harnessed and weaponized, because humans understood that breaking morale was often easier than breaking bodies. And despite the brutality, there was intelligence here, strategy, observation, iteration. Medieval warfare was a harsh classroom, and its students learned quickly. Every failure became data. Every survival became proof of concept. It's tempting to view medieval weapons as crude or barbaric compared to modern technology. But in reality, they were incredibly sophisticated responses to the conditions of their time. They were built by people who understood materials, force, leverage, and human psychology long before those concepts had tidy scientific names. Creative medieval weapons weren't about cruelty. They were about adaptation, about refusing to be helpless, about solving problems with the tools available, no matter how uncomfortable the solution looked. In the end, medieval warfare wasn't defined by swords or spikes. It was defined by ingenuity under pressure. And that, more than anything, is what made these weapons truly medieval. Theodora was born around the year 500 in Constantinople, not into marble halls or silk-draped chambers, but into the unstable, loud and unforgiving margins of Byzantine society. Her father worked as a bear-keeper for the Hippodrome, the vast arena where chariot racing, factional violence, and imperial politics collided. It was a dangerous job, poorly paid, and utterly dependent on public favour. When he died while Theodora was still a child, her family fell immediately into hardship. In Byzantium, status was inherited, and without a male protector, a family could vanish socially almost overnight. From an early age, Theodora learned that survival depended on adaptability. There was no illusion of innocence in her upbringing. The city around her was magnificent and cruel in equal measure, and it rewarded cleverness far more than virtue. As a teenager, she entered the world of the stage. Officially, she was an actress, performing comedic and dramatic roles for public audiences. In reality, Byzantine moral codes treated actresses as morally suspect at best and openly dishonorable at worst. Law and custom grouped them with prostitutes, denying them respectability, legal protection, and any chance of marrying into the elite. Yet the stage gave Theodora something most women of her background never possessed: an audience. Performing before crowds taught her how to command attention, how to read emotion, and how to manipulate expectation. She learned when to provoke laughter, when to provoke discomfort, and when to hold silence just long enough to dominate a room. These were not theatrical tricks alone. They were political skills in their earliest form. Contemporary sources hostile to Theodora later exaggerated her performances into scandal, portraying her youth as depraved and immoral. What matters more than the gossip is the reality beneath it. She lived in a society that left women of her class with few choices. Theodora did not collapse under that pressure. She observed it, learned from it, and endured it. By the time she left Constantinople in early adulthood, traveling through the eastern provinces of the empire, she was no longer merely a performer. She was a woman hardened by poverty, trained in persuasion, and acutely aware of how power truly functioned. Long before she ever wore a crown, Theodora understood crowds, fear, and authority. Those lessons learned at the bottom of society would later shape the fate of an empire. After leaving Constantinople, Theodora disappeared from the capital's brutal spotlight and entered a period of wandering that would quietly reshape her life. She travelled east across the Byzantine world, eventually reaching North Africa, where she lived for several years, far from the hippodrome crowds and their easy cruelty. This was not a triumphant exile. It was a retreat forced by exhaustion, disillusionment, and the limits of survival through performance alone. For the first time, Theodora lived without an audience. In these provinces, she encountered communities very different from the glittering cynicism of the capital. Here, religious debate mattered deeply, especially the growing divide within Christianity. Theodora became closely associated with Monophysite believers, a theological movement considered heretical by the imperial establishment, but deeply rooted among the poor and marginalized. This was not merely a spiritual shift, it was political education. Theodora saw firsthand how doctrine could divide populations, justify persecution, and create loyalty stronger than blood or law. During this period, she adopted a life of austerity. Sources describe her living modestly, supporting herself through textile work rather than performance. Whether fully accurate or shaped by later admiration, the transformation is clear. Theodora was no longer defined by spectacle. She was reshaping her identity. Poverty no longer humiliated her, it disciplined her. When she eventually returned to Constantinople, she was not the same woman who had left. Gone was the reckless performer defined by public scandal. In her place stood someone controlled, observant, and intensely serious. She understood suffering now, not as an abstraction, but as lived reality. That understanding would later shape her sympathy toward women, the poor, and religious minorities. It was around this time that she crossed paths with Justinian, then a rising political figure and nephew of the reigning emperor. Their meeting was not destiny wrapped in romance. It was strategic convergence. Justinian saw intelligence, charisma, and resolve beneath Theodora's controversial past. She saw ambition backed by proximity to power. Both recognized the other as useful, dangerous, and rare. Their relationship faced immediate resistance. Law forbade high-ranking officials from marrying actresses. Rather than abandon her, Justinian changed the law itself. This was the first sign of Theodora's influence even before she wore the imperial crown. Her life had already proven one thing beyond doubt. She could not be erased, silenced, or contained. She had learned to survive obscurity, and now she was ready to return to the center of power, on her own terms. When Justinian ascended the throne in the year 527, Theodora rose with him, not as a decorative consort, but as a ruling partner. From the moment she was crowned Augusta, it was clear that this was not a traditional imperial marriage. Theodora did not remain behind palace walls, content with ceremony and titles. She attended councils, received foreign envoys, and involved herself directly in matters of law, religion, and security. For many in the Byzantine elite, her presence was unsettling. An empress with a voice was one thing, an empress who expected to be obeyed was another. Her background made her uniquely suited to power. Unlike aristocrats raised in comfort, Theodora understood fear, hunger, and public humiliation. She knew how quickly crowds could turn violent, and how easily authority could collapse if it appeared weak. This realism shaped her political instincts. She favored decisive action over compromise and loyalty over tradition. Those who underestimated her did so briefly. Theodora quickly became a protector of marginalized groups, especially women. She pushed for laws that punished sexual exploitation, expanded property rights for women, and allowed former prostitutes legal protection and the chance at a new life. These reforms were not abstract morality. They were personal. Theodora legislated from memory, reshaping law to prevent others from enduring what she once had. Her religious influence was equally significant. Though officially aligned with imperial orthodoxy, she quietly supported Monophysite Christians, sheltering their leaders within the palace and using imperial authority to moderate persecution. This balancing act required extraordinary political finesse. Theodora managed to defend theological minorities without openly challenging imperial doctrine, proving she understood power not as blunt force, but as pressure applied at the right moment. Court historians later struggled to categorize her. Some portrayed her as ruthless, others as saintly. Both missed the point. Theodora was pragmatic. She believed the empire survived through strength, discipline, and calculated mercy, not nostalgia for tradition. She had no patience for elites who confused lineage with competence. By the early years of Justinian's reign, it was already clear that the empire was ruled by two minds, not one. Theodora was not an exception to Byzantine politics. She was its evolution. Her authority did not come from birth or military command, but from an unshakable understanding of human behavior. That made her dangerous and indispensable. In the year 532, Constantinople erupted into chaos. What began as factional violence between rival chariot teams exploded into full-scale rebellion. The city burned as mobs seized streets, murdered officials, and declared a rival emperor. This was the Nika Revolt, the most dangerous uprising of Justinian's reign, and for several days it appeared that his rule and his life were finished. As flames consumed palaces and churches, panic spread through the imperial court. Advisors urged Justinian to flee across the Bosporus, abandon the capital, and regroup elsewhere. Escape ships were prepared. Survival, they argued, was preferable to martyrdom. In that moment of fear, authority wavered. The empire teetered on the edge of collapse. It was Theodora who refused to yield. According to later accounts, she stood before the council and delivered words that became legend. Royalty, she said, was a noble burial shroud. To flee was to live in shame. To die as an empress was preferable to survival without power. This was not rhetoric born of pride. It was political clarity. Theodora understood something her panicked advisors did not. Once an emperor runs, he ceases to be emperor. Retreat would not save Justinian. It would end him. Her resolve forced a decision. Justinian stayed. What followed was brutal and decisive. Imperial forces sealed the hippodrome where the rebels had gathered, believing themselves victorious. Then, the army struck. Tens of thousands were slaughtered in a single day. The revolt ended not with negotiation, but annihilation. The city was scarred, but the throne was secure. Theodora's role in this moment permanently altered how power was perceived within the empire. She had not commanded troops, yet she had determined the outcome. Her courage was not reckless, it was calculated. She recognized that fear spreads faster than fire, and that authority survives only when it refuses to retreat. After the revolt, her influence only deepened. Officials who had hesitated were sidelined. Loyalty became the currency of survival. The rebuilt Constantinople, monuments, churches, and laws rose from ashes shaped by Theodora's iron resolve. The Nika Revolt revealed her true nature. She was not merely Justinian's equal in intellect. She was, in moments of crisis, his anchor. Where others saw ruin, Theodora saw the narrow path to absolute control, and she walked it without hesitation. With the empire stabilized after the Nika Revolt, Theodora turned her attention to something less dramatic, but far more enduring: the law. While Justinian is remembered as the great codifier of Roman law, the reforms of his reign were not crafted by jurists alone. Behind many of the most radical changes stood Theodora. shaping legislation with the clarity of someone who had lived under the system's harshest blind spots. Theodora pushed relentlessly for legal protections for women, especially those society preferred to forget. She championed laws that criminalized forced prostitution and punished men who exploited vulnerable women. For the first time, rape was treated as a serious crime, regardless of the victim's social status. Divorce laws were altered to allow women greater agency, and property rights were expanded so wives were no longer legally invisible within marriage. These were not symbolic gestures. They altered daily life for thousands. Perhaps most telling was her creation of safe houses for former prostitutes, state-supported institutions where women could live without being dragged back into exploitation. Critics mocked these efforts as sentimental or hypocritical, pointing to her past. Theodora ignored them. She understood that moral authority did not come from purity, but from resolve. Her reforms were unapologetically interventionist. The state, she believed, had a responsibility to restrain abuse, not excuse it. Her influence extended beyond gender. Theodora consistently argued for mercy toward the poor and restraint toward religious minorities. She saw persecution not as strength, but as administrative failure. When dissent was crushed too harshly, it bred martyrs. When managed carefully, it dissolved. This philosophy quietly shaped imperial policy, even when it contradicted the instincts of military commanders and bishops. What unsettled the aristocracy was not merely the content of these reforms, but their source. Law had always flowed downward from elite men trained in rhetoric and lineage. Now, it was being reshaped by a woman whose authority came from experience rather than pedigree. Theodora did not argue theory. She argued consequences. By embedding compassion into imperial law, she altered the moral architecture of Byzantium. The empire did not become gentle, but it became more controlled, more deliberate, and less casually cruel. Long after fires were extinguished and rebellions forgotten, these laws remained. Theodora understood something few rulers ever grasp. Violence secures power quickly, but law secures it quietly. And quietly, she rewrote the empire in her own image. As Justinian's reign matured, the empire faced a quieter but equally dangerous threat: religious fracture. Doctrinal conflict cut through cities and villages, dividing families, provoking riots, and undermining loyalty to the throne. Official policy enforced Chalcedonian orthodoxy, but large populations, especially in Egypt and Syria, remained loyal to Monophysite Christianity. Crushing them outright risked rebellion. Tolerating them openly risked accusations of weakness. This was the dilemma Theodora chose to manage personally. Theodora was herself sympathetic to the Monophysite cause, but she was not reckless. She never attempted to overturn official doctrine. Instead, she worked from the shadows, offering protection rather than proclamation. Monophysite bishops were secretly housed within palace compounds, shielded from arrest, interrogated privately rather than publicly humiliated, and quietly allowed to maintain networks of influence. Theodora turned the imperial court into a place of unofficial asylum. This approach served two purposes. It reduced unrest in the provinces, while allowing Justinian to maintain the appearance of theological authority. Where the emperor ruled by decree, Theodora ruled by access. She decided who was heard, who was spared, and who was silenced discreetly. In an empire where religion and politics were inseparable, this made her one of the most powerful figures alive. Not everyone approved. Orthodox clergy resented her interference, and court insiders whispered that she was undermining the spiritual unity of the empire. Theodora responded with patience, rather than confrontation. She understood that belief could not be coerced into obedience. Stability required tolerance, carefully disguised as discipline. Her religious policy reflected her broader worldview. Theodora did not believe in absolute conformity. She believed in containment. Differences could exist as long as they did not challenge the throne. Violence in her mind was a sign that governance had failed upstream. Even Justinian, a man deeply invested in theological legacy, deferred to her judgment in these matters more often than sources openly admit. When tensions threatened to boil over, it was usually Theodora who advised restraint, delay, or quiet compromise. She had learned long ago that people pushed too hard eventually push back harder. By managing belief as a political force rather than a moral battlefield, Theodora kept the empire from tearing itself apart. Her faith was real, but her loyalty was always to stability. In Byzantium, that distinction meant survival. This chapter of her rule reveals her most subtle strength. Theodora did not need public victories. She was content shaping outcomes invisibly, confident that history would move in the direction she set, even if it never spoke her name aloud. By the late years of Justinian's reign, the nature of authority in Byzantium had quietly shifted. The court still revolved around the emperor, but those who mattered understood an unspoken truth. Access to power ran just as decisively through Theodora. Petitions, appointments, and survival itself often depended on whether one had fallen into her favor or her suspicion. She did not need proclamations to rule. Influence was enough. Theodora was feared not because she was unpredictable, but because she was consistent. She rewarded loyalty without sentiment and punished betrayal without